A lot of hacking videos on YouTube are about Wi-Fi hacking. They show you how you can use various tools on Kali Linux like KRACK or some dauthor to DOS clients. But I never wanted to do that. I find it quite boring. That doesn't mean that I'm entirely not interested in Wi-Fi hacking. It's just that if I would make a video about it, it would be about one specific attack in detail, how it works, rather than just how to use a tool. And so with the recent disclosure for KRACK, key reinstallation attacks on WPA2, I figured that's the perfect moment to do exactly that. Key reinstallation attacks forcing nonce reuse in WPA2 by Matty van Hoof, released around October 2017, is a paper detailing a specific protocol flaw. And I encourage you to read this paper because the news around this attack is obviously going completely insane with so much misinformation going around. And so if you're actually interested in what this attack means, how it works, and what are the actual threats, read it from the source. I know papers can look intimidating, but it's often enough to read the abstract and the conclusion to get a good intuition for what this is about. And then you have all the content in between to go more in depth. So let's start with that. All protected Wi-Fi networks use the four-way handshake to generate a fresh session key. However, we show that the four-way handshake is vulnerable to a key reinstallation attack. Here, the adversary tricks a victim into reinstalling an already in-use key. This is achieved by manipulating and replaying handshake messages. When reinstalling the key, associated parameters such as the incremental transmit packet number, nonce, and the receive packet number, replay counter, are reset to their initial value. Our key reinstallation attack also breaks the peer key, group key, and fast BSS transition handshake. The impact depends on the handshake being attacked and the data confidentiality protocol in use. Notably, our attack is exceptionally devastating against Android 6.0. It forces the client into using a predictable all-zero encryption key. So there's a lot of information here, and let's try to dissect the meaning of this. All protected Wi-Fi networks use the four-way handshake to generate a fresh session key. Figure 2 shows the messages exchanged when a client connects to an access point. And of course, those initial messages are not encrypted. You see that after the four-way handshake, encrypted data frames can now be exchanged. The fresh session key they were talking about is the PTK, the pairwise transient key, which is derived here. The PTK is generated by concatenating the pairwise master key, which itself is derived from basically the password you enter for the Wi-Fi, the access point nonce, anonce, you see it here being sent from the access point to the client, and the client nonce, snonce, which is generated by the client and sent to the access point. But that's not all. Also, the access point MAC address and the station MAC address is used in the generation of the PTK. So using this pre-shared secret, the Wi-Fi password, both the client and server now know the same pairwise transient key. And you can already see here what that means generally for the security. If anybody else knows the Wi-Fi password and observes the nonces being exchanged, they can derive your pairwise transient key and can decrypt your traffic. So when you connect to a secure Wi-Fi in a hotel, you might not be as secure as you thought you would be, but that's a different issue. And then there are different protocols to actually implement the encryption. For example, if TKIP is used, then the encryption algorithm is RC4, and that is basically the same as WEP and therefore vulnerable to a number of similar attacks. But another option is the CCMP protocol, which is AES in CCM mode, counter mode with CBC MAC. It is secure as long as no initialization vector IV is repeated under a particular key. And the IV here is the nonce. And the nonce is again constantly incremented to make sure it will never repeat. And basically the same is true for the GCMP protocol. It uses AES GCM and is secure as long as no IV is repeated under a particular key. If that sounds weird to you, you should watch my video Breaking ECDSA elliptic curve cryptography. Of course, ECDSA is very strong, but there can be a flaw if it's not properly implemented, namely if a fixed value is used for a parameter instead of a random one. So very similar in the sense that the security of a crypto algorithm can be very fragile. And so for these algorithms, if the IV, the nonce, is reused for the same key, it can probably be broken. So you can kind of see where this is going. Let's continue reading. We show that the four-way handshake is vulnerable to a key reinstallation attack. Here the adversary tricks the victim into installing an already in-use key. This is achieved by manipulating and replaying handshake messages. Just in case it confuses you what reinstalling or installing the key means. It basically just means that the protocol decided this is the key we use. If we make an analogy of how that would be implemented in code, it's basically just assigning the key now to the variable, the key we use. Okay, so radio networks or any other communication has to handle the case when messages get lost. And they have to agree how to handle that. For example, retransmitting them. And so, because messages may be lost or dropped, the access point will retransmit message 3 if it did not receive an appropriate response as acknowledgement. As a result, the client may receive message 3 multiple times. Each time it receives this message, it will reinstall the same session key and thereby reset the incremental transmit packet number nonce. We can show that an attacker can force these nonce resets by collecting and replaying retransmissions of message 3. When reinstalling the key, associated parameters such as the incremental transmit packet number nonce and receive packet number replay counter are reset to their initial value. Depending on which protocol is used, this allows an adversary to replay, decrypt, and/or forge packets. And so it's now easy to imagine that if you can keep resetting the key parameters, some crypto stuff will be effed up. And this is a protocol flaw because the specification is not quite clear about how to handle a retransmit of message 3, and thus opening the door for certain crypto attacks depending on which crypto algorithm is used. Some are more susceptible than others. The author also checked the behavior of different implementations, and it turns out iOS and Windows both don't follow the spec and don't accept the retransmission of message 3. And the worst implementation is by some Linux-based systems because there is an additional implementation bug that resets the key to all zeros. So you don't even have to perform this crypto attack, limiting you to maybe only decryption, I don't know, because with this flaw you actually know the key because all of the values are set to 0. Okay, there are a lot of technical details and challenges and nuances that you can read about in the paper. I presented it more simplified, but hopefully it's more accurate than some other news headlines. So, summarize. WPA2 uses a four-way handshake where nonces are exchanged and used together with the Wi-Fi password to generate the key. This key is then used for encrypting packets. How it is used depends on the actual crypto algorithm being used. A lot of crypto algorithms are very fragile when certain values are reused. And the attack presented in this paper is about forcing a reset of these values, specifically the nonce, which would be constantly incremented and thus would always be different, and thus opening the door to perform certain crypto attacks. And this is a protocol design flaw. But additionally, during this research, a very serious software bug was discovered where on certain implementations the key was not just reset to initial parameters, but was actually set to 0. So you actually know the key and you don't have to perform a crypto attack. But you know what? Why don't you read the paper? You don't learn hacking when reading security news headlines or use the tool Matthew Van Huff wrote. Go read the actual research, or at least parts of it.